In this edition of New England Authors, we'll talk with Jennifer Wisner Kelly, an exciting new author who's won prizes and acclaim for her book of short stories, which take place in our region. Let's listen to who she is and how she's perfecting her art. Our author today is Jennifer Wisner Kelly, who's written a very exciting book called Stone Skimmers. It's a collection of short stories. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You are an attorney, right?
I am, yeah.
Oh, you still are an attorney?
Yes.
Why and when did you take up writing?
Well, I started out as an attorney right out of law school and worked at a big firm here in Boston, and it wasn't for me. And so when I had my first child, I quit law and stayed home with my child and then started writing, which is what I had always kind of dreamed of doing. And only in the last couple of years have I actually started practicing again. So now I do both.
So you do both. You do both writing and you grew up in Connecticut, is that right?
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in Connecticut called Deep River, which the stories in the book are really a hybrid, a fictional town that's a hybrid between the area I grew up, which is coastal Connecticut, right at the mouth of the Connecticut River, and where I live now, which is Concord, Massachusetts. So I kind of put those two inspirations together to create one fictional Connecticut town.
So now your first book takes place right in the first story, takes place, and it is called Stone Skimmers.
It is.
It's about a bunch of teenagers, right? And I wonder if you could maybe read from that story.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It takes place in this town, and a bunch of teenagers, but there's another person who is kind of an outsider, and that's important, right? To your story, that a person's outsider.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll read from the beginning of it, just to sort of set the stage. Okay, let's see. Each night at dusk, we built our fire in the usual spot, back from the water's edge, camouflaged by white-barked birches and scraggly pines. We sprawled our bodies across the rocks and logs that encircled this makeshift hearth. Finally, we said, a place of our own. The town reservoir was broad and held back on the western side by a squat concrete dam. Its deep water had a surreal ability to reflect our many moods, brash, sullen, languid, or golden. Or maybe we would wonder, after a particularly relaxing smoke, maybe our moods were created by the water itself, chicken or the egg and all that. There was only one beach belonging to the camp for inner city kids. Otherwise, swimming was off limits. The restriction was supposed to keep the water potable, but somehow those interlopers had secured a dispensation, as if their germs wouldn't contaminate the water the way that ours surely would. We figured we had more of a claim to the reservoir than those kids, having lived our whole lives in Old Stonington, a tiny village subsumed within an already inconsequential Connecticut town. We had been inseparable since our time at the Red Wagon nursery school, a place our mothers chose, not so much for the virtues it espoused, social development, child-driven learning, the power of play, but for the implicit promises it made, Colby, Williams, Harvard, not anywhere in state, except Yale, of course. Promises that would finally come to fruition in the fall, for the most part, to our mothers' smug satisfaction. Don't ever let it be said, though, that our mothers weren't willing to toil for their children's well-being. At the Red Wagon, they had volunteered to scrub miniature toilets and knee-high sinks, feigned enthusiasm for finger painting and sand tables, all for our benefit. Whether or not we would have chosen one another as playmates without our mother's intervention became as irrelevant over the years as whether we would have chosen our parents or our siblings or Old Stonington itself. And as you say, an interloper comes into that cozy group.
You established this group. They were together from the very early age, and they're an in-group. They're together. And then this interloper, what's her name, Julia?
Eevee. Eevee is
She comes, so they're at this reservoir, and she comes and starts swimming very well, across the reservoir and then back again. But nobody knows anything about her.
Right.
What's the reaction of these teenagers?
Well, for them, they're in their cozy circle and they're at that verge of adulthood. They're all seniors in high school. This is the summer before they launch off to college. And they feel very threatened by this girl who they don't know, but who they suspect knows something maybe they don't, because she has such a confidence in herself, or she seems to. And she seems to have such a sense of identity, whereas their identity is only group-based.
Yeah.
So they're both drawn to her, but their instinctive adolescent reaction is to ostracize her. So
Yeah,
the story sort of follows how do they react to her, and do they react to her only as a group or also as individuals?
But one person befriends her.
Yes.
And who is this?
One boy, Thomas, decides to reach out to the girl. And his backstory is that he and his sister, who are both part of this same clique, several years earlier, another sibling of theirs had died through what was said to be a tragic accident, but possibly was a suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And they're mourning that in their own repressed, quiet way. And Thomas reaches out to Eevee and leaves behind this clique of that he's been with since birth, essentially.
Oh. This is New England Authors. We're speaking with Jennifer Wisner Kelly, and we're talking about her book, Stone Skimmers, which is a book of short stories. It's a debut book.
It is.
Yeah. When did you start writing, by the way?
Oh, start writing in general, or this book in particular?
Yeah, when did you start? You published before you published this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started writing, as I said, about with any real seriousness, about 20 years ago when my son was a baby. And it was a slow process because I was also raising children at the time. And these stories were begun about 10 years ago. I write very slowly, so I would work my way through them. I went to grad school for writing at the same time. So the stories have been written over a long stretch of time.
Now, short stories for me are actually harder to write than novels because you have to condense so much. Why didn't you write a novel?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think I started out with short fiction because that's kind of the form that's most common for new writers, for graduate students. It's an easy way to have a small chunk that you can work on. But then I really fell in love with that form, and I read much more of it. And actually what I found with my stories is these are actually quite long as short stories go. I think the shortest is probably about 30 pages.
Yeah.
And on many of them, I think at least 3 were actually much longer, were novella length or even the beginning of a novel, and then I compressed them back to this form. So,
I see. That's really hard to do, to take all
it's hard and yet easy in some ways, because I think writing a novel is its own challenge, which I have a novel that I'm working on now, and I'm finding that to be difficult to take it the longer distance. So I'm now so used to this compressed form and find it very satisfying.
So, okay, let's get back to the story here. We have this girl who's an outsider, and she's swimming, and people are intrigued by her. They spend a lot of time thinking about her. We find out that she's training for a marathon swim. We find out later she's training for a marathon swim. What's her story?
Well, it's funny you would say that. There actually was an 8th story for the collection that didn't make it in because I've never been wholly satisfied with it. That is called Eevee's story. That really is about her. But she, in that story, what readers won't learn here, but in my imagination is her backstory, is she lives in the local town. Her father is a math teacher at the private high school that's nearby, and her mother is gone. And it's unclear to these teenagers whether the mother is gone because she's died or she's left, but that's an extremely unusual situation in this cozy kind of community of very traditional family structures. So they can't quite decide whether they see that as alluring or sad, but they're drawn to it. So Eevee is nursing her own set of wounds that the characters in this story both don't know and are only slightly mature enough to start to care about as the story develops.
What I took away from that is a story about in-group, out-group, which is what sociologists call that. Is that right? Is that you wanted to focus on people who are a little bit different?
I think that's absolutely one thing that's in this story. I think each story speaks to each reader in their own way. So yes, that's absolutely a part of what I was writing about. I also was writing about that stage of life, that adolescent stage of life. I was curious about the idea of group identity. The story is unusual in that it's written in first person plural. It's a we narrator, which is not a very common way to tell a story, but it's very appropriate here where it's told retrospectively. It's an adult who's looking back on this group, but that group identity was so powerful for
Very
them.
powerful,
So
yeah.
I was sort of interested in that, how I have teenagers of my own, and I did when I was writing this story, and I think
they were the inspiration for it.
I promise them that they are not in this book in any way, but seeing them go through that phase reminded me of my own time in that phase where what's most important to you at that age is fitting in and having a group identity.
Yes.
But as we get to be adults, we realize that having an individual identity is actually really at the heart of a well-lived life.
Yeah, so you had to go back into that mindset, and you do it very well. I think it's great. Now, your second story takes place in rural Vermont, right?
Yes.
Did you want to read another bit of that?
Yeah, I could read a little piece of that one.
Okay.
So each of the stories, it's worth saying, are very loosely linked to that first story. So Thomas, that we talked about before, the one boy who reaches out, occurs in this second story tangentially. He is a father who has left his family. So the story is really about his wife, who is still back in her hometown after having moved here to Cambridge to go to college.
Yeah.
She's back in her hometown with her two children, while Thomas, this romantic, kind of rosy-eyed thinker, has left her. So it's the middle of the winter in Vermont, and they've had a thaw, a significant thaw. So I'll just read a quick bit of what the thaw is like as she's kind of waiting to see, is he going to come back, and is blinded a little bit to the risks that her children maybe are facing in this small community. The thaw gives the farm a drippy sound. Droplets fall from the icicles edging the roof, where the ice is a foot thick, and translucent spikes dangle from a frozen portcullis. Sheets of snow slide periodically from the sun-baked roof in startling whooshes. Adeline wonders, what determines when an icicle will finally harpoon to the ground, when snow will finally let go of the roof, when a branch will snap in a light breeze after having withstood the 2 blizzards that blew through in January? All around her, nature is finding this tipping point and greedily trying to move from winter to spring. The shoveled paths in the barnyard, from the porch to the chicken coop and down to the woodshed, have melted until now mud appears in patches, and the paths feel less like trenches than gentle suggestions of which way to go. But it's an illusion. Even after half a week of melt, snow is still high in the farmyard, slushy and slippery to walk on. From beneath the massive snowbanks piled at the end of the driveway by the plow, rivulets of water escape, making their gentle way down the slope from the farm to the road, gathering and twisting into a torrent that carves a gully alongside the driveway deep enough to trap a car tire if you aren't careful. In the afternoon light, the snow's surface turns pale blue, the color of her children's cold lips when they stay out to play longer than they should, but deep below that, there is a hint of warm pink, like a hidden pulse.
Beautifully written. I told you she was a good writer. Okay.
Thanks.
So you talk about Thomas from the first story, and he starts chopping wood like crazy, and then all of a sudden just disappears. What were you trying to make out of that fellow?
Well, we've met him a little bit in the first story, and we see that he's capable of a bold gesture to move away from a group. But he also, you learn in the second story, is a bit of a hopeless romantic. So when he moves to Vermont, Adeline is from a small town in Vermont and has kind of escaped that world. She meets Thomas, who's from a wealthy community and privileged land, and he wants to go to Vermont and start this heirloom seed company,
Right, right.
which is a fundamentally flawed idea, because the way he's doing it, a farmer could grow the seeds, harvest their own seeds, and have them forevermore. But in his mind, this is the way to return to sort of pureness.
Organic.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. And I think that part of the story is really about his disappointment in this fantasy he's created for himself, that he thinks this is going to be this beautiful, perfect life with his children and his wife, and this vision he has, this sort of Eden vision. And when reality rears its ugly head, he can't process that and becomes sort of fixated on how to leave. And that's him when he starts chopping wood.
Yeah. So one of the main characters of the story is a fox.
Yes.
And I think he comes up right at the beginning, that maybe there's a fox in the woodshed.
Yeah.
And in fact, he turns out to be a very nice, a very nice fox.
He is.
He's more of a cat than a fox.
Yes.
He does everything but purr. He sits on the main character's lap, and very nice to stroke the fox, I guess. But he's also maybe indicted in killing a couple of chickens that belong to the daughter Lizzie, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Why did you pick this fox?
Well, the fox actually in many ways was the inspiration for the story, because I used to live in Carlisle, Massachusetts, in a farm with an very old barn. And one day I found a dead fox in the bottom of my barn, and the fox was so beautiful that as I brought it to bring it to a safe place to bury it, I thought, this is such a beautiful animal. And it got me thinking about it. And in this story, the fox plays a part of distracting Adeline, the mom, from what's really going on around her. So the story is told from 3 points of view. It's Adeline's, and then there are segments from her son's perspective, who's about 13 or 14, and her daughter's perspective, who's about maybe 9 or 10. And I think what I wanted to create was a triangle between those 3 perspectives, 3 different people experiencing this loss of the father, and each one in their own way not coping and not being able to connect with each other. And the fox is this distraction to Adeline that she becomes somewhat obsessed with, to the detriment of her children, who are at risk in their own social community.
You're listening to New England Authors. We're speaking with Jennifer Wisner Kelly. She's written an exciting book called Stone Skimmers, which is a collection of short stories. So what's the writing process like for you?
Well, it differs, from time to time. I think on a day in, day out basis, when I'm busy on a project, I like to always put in a few hours, because I think it keeps the gel or the materials gelling. But I have periods where I don't write that much, other than brief journaling and idea generation. And in this case, I worked very systematically on each story. I tend not to work on multiple stories at once. I tend to focus on that one thing until I've polished that piece to a point where I'm satisfied with it.
Where did you learn this craft?
Well, I started with local classes, here in the Cambridge area. I took classes, and then eventually I went back to graduate school, and I studied at the Warren Wilson College program, MFA program for writers, which is actually based in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina. So I was there for 3 years, and that's really where I honed my skills.
Did you write a lot of other stories before?
I've written quite a few others, but I would say these are the stories that I felt they all linked together, and they were part of a cohesive thematic whole. Many of the other stories have been left on the cutting room floor.
So when you compose a story, is plot or character the main or setting?
Character is definitely, hands down. I think each story kind of comes together from one spark, like we talked about the fox being the spark in that story, that maybe something I observed or experienced or read about that just struck my imagination. But really what creates the story is whatever character then presents himself or herself to my imagination. And how those two things then intertwine is the creation of the story. And I don't really know when I sit down to write where the story's going. I tend to revise a lot, so you sort of take your first crack at it and then you see where it goes.
In your second story, you feel a lot of sympathy for your central character, Adeline. Yeah. What type of books do you read to get your inspiration?
I read everything under the sun. I think
that's a writer.
I've always been an avid reader, so I can't say I have one particular thing. Right now, I'm reading a novel, but then I had just read a memoir and a book of essays. So I'm always reading something new. And I read both new things that are out right now and out by friends that are writing, and things that were written a long time ago. And so it's whatever strikes my mood.
Okay. You want to talk a little about your other stories in there?
Oh, sure. I mean, the stories, as we discussed a little bit, are linked together by this group of friends and by this town, but they're not all set in the town. There's in addition to the two we've just talked about in detail, and Thaw is actually the longest story in the group. There are, there's two more that are set in that town. There's one that's up in New Hampshire in the woods, essentially on a hike that's part of a neurotherapeutic boarding school for a man who's dealing with a son who's kind of gone astray. And there's one that's set down in Mexico as two sisters go on a cave dive that goes very badly awry. And there's a final one that's...
and one of them has to sacrifice the other. And how she deals with these complex feelings she has from her own youth about a sister she both loves, but who has overshadowed her for much of her life, and the own crises she's dealing with in her life. And the cave becomes a place where she makes a sacrifice to So I was wondering if that cave was Plato's cave.
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but I like it. If it is to you, I think that's great. The cave was inspired. I have been cave diving in this part of the part of the world, and it was a very powerful experience, and it's a very transformational place. And the Mayans who once lived there, or in some ways still do live there, see this as a place of transformation, an entrance to the underworld, and it when you go in those places, they do have that feeling of a place where a person could be transformed, or a place where you might do things you didn't know that you were capable of doing. And that really was the inspiration for what might a person be willing to do under certain circumstances.
So transformation is very important in your work. Have you had personal experience of that?
Oh, haven't we all? I mean, I think transformation is at the blood of all of our lives, that we all are constantly evolving from who we were as children and adolescents into who we are now. And I look for moments in my own fiction where, whether it's because something external has happened to a character, an act of God, or whether, a relationship situation, where their life will pivot emotionally at that stage, where they will be transformed and be someone else on the other side of that experience.
So a lot of your books take place, of course, a lot of your stories take place in New England. Do you find this an inspirational place to... it's a loaded question because...
exactly. If I say no, then we'll stop recording. Well, absolutely. I am New England born and bred. I've lived my whole life here, other than I've had stints in other locations, but I think for many writers, the place where they grew up sits in their imagination very strongly. And I think that's very much true for me. I think there's so much here to think about in terms of emotional dynamics, class dynamics, dynamics with nature and family. All of that is in New England is a microcosm for the rest of the world. So
great. What are we going to see? Another collection of short stories? We're going to see a novel?
I'm hoping a novel is the next step. I have been at work on a novel for a while. It's going a little more slowly than I would like, but I'm hoping that's my next project, and it's also New England set. So well, congratulations for winning the prize on this book of short stories. It's called Stone Skimmers, and you are a talented writer. We're glad to have you on the show. This is New England Authors. We're recording here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you miss any episode, you can go to YouTube and see them. We broadcast on stations throughout the region, and remember, watch locally.
Bye.